Hey everyone, what is up? Luke here and welcome back to another episode here on YouTube focusing in on how to beat low stakes PLO games. In our first episode we focused specifically on 3-betting pre-flop and I showed you some of the mistakes many players are making. In today's episode we're going to focus on a post-flop scenario and I'm going to give you 3 tips on how to play pocket aces post-flop in PLO. If you haven't checked out the first episode, then make sure to do so. I will put down a link below the episode. Let's jump right into the action of today's topic, which is about post-flop strategy with pocket aces. First, we're going to look into c-betting in single raise pots in position with pocket aces. What I see many players do playing low stakes PLO is that they are overvaluing their pocket aces. They are over c-betting them, they don't focus on the right components in their hand, and they don't think enough about how their pre-flop range interacts with the board texture. Pocket aces need specific components and characteristics in order to justify a c-bet in most scenarios in Pot Limit Omaha. You cannot c-bet them regardlessly of the board and regardlessly of the pre-flop ranges. Now this is one of the things that I see players making mistakes on all the time. And I'm going to give you some advice and some examples here to help you improve your strategy. First things first, when you think about playing aces in PLO and you're c-betting them in position in a single raise pot, it's important to think about a few components in your hand and a few characteristics. In general, you want to c-bet with aces that have high equity, that have a draw with nutted components, and if you don't have a strong made hand or a strong draw, you only want to bet aces if they have strong blockers in combination with bad playability when checking. In other words, you don't want to c-bet and have to fold against a raise too often with pocket aces, because aces generally have a good amount of showdown value in many scenarios. So if you do plan to bet them and fold against a raise, you need to have good reasons for it. In other words, you need to have strong blockers in combination with bad playability when checking. Aces you want to check are often medium strong hands. They hate to get check raised and they cannot double or triple barrel with a high frequency on most runouts. These aces have non-nutted draws and they simply cannot bet very often on turns and rivers. Let's look into an example here. Here we see a board 9-7-3 two-toned. It's a single raise pot scenario with 100 big blind stack sizes. We sit on the button and the big blind calls pre-flop and now this board comes up. Now we want to value bet with aces, which we just learned, that have high equity, that have nutted components, and that can double or triple barrel with a high frequency. These are aces like ace, queen, jack with a nut flush draw. There's a backdoor straight draw, you have a strong overpair, and you have a nut flush draw as mentioned here. Other aces to value bet here are ace, 8-6. We have an open-ender, we have a backdoor flush draw, we have a spade blocker, and we have enough runouts where we continue to barrel on, as well as that we can continue against a check raise. Now aces that we want to bet fold here, we also have a few in our range. And the reason here is that some of our aces just play very poorly when they check back, but they do have right characteristics to go for a bet and having to fold versus the check raise. Aces that we want to bet fold here, to make our opponent fold here and not having to play a check-check scenario and going to the turn, are hands like ace 10-3 for example. Here we have the nut flush draw blocker, we have a 3 blocker as well as a 10, which is blocking some of the straight draw components, straight draw combinations in our opponent's continuing range. The ace of spades helps us to barrel on future runouts when the flush hits, and we have some blockers to make our opponent fold right away with the 10 and the 3 as well. Another example here would be ace 8 deuce. Now you can see that these aces are very disconnected and they would play very bad in a scenario where we check because we cannot continue on most of the turn cards when our opponent bets into us. While at the same time we have the right components in our hand to make a bet and hope to make our opponent fold here right away. Aces that we want to check have non-nutted components, they hate to get check raised, and they cannot double or triple barrel with a high frequency. Hence like ace 6-4 and ace jack 10. Here we do have a low flush draw or a gutter with the Jack 10 here, with the backdoor flush draw. But these hands would really hate to get check raised. But they do have enough playability this time to go for a check and then continue, for example, versus a bet if our opponent stabs the turn. Now, I see many players at low stakes c-betting these hands and overvaluing them. But that is not the right way you want to approach this hand. You want to pot control and keep the pot manageable with hands that don't do well on a lot of turns and rivers in terms of nuttiness, that don't do well against a check raise, and they generally don't benefit from building a large pot on the flop already because they cannot bet turns and rivers with a very high frequency. Even with the ace 6-4 with the spade. Like imagine you bet and your opponent calls and the turn brings a spade. Are you happy to continue and barrel the turn and the river with a 6-high flush? Very often not. You're just gonna check and you put yourself in an awkward river scenario if your opponent now, for example, goes for a big bet on the river. Or even if your opponent leads the turn there, what are you gonna do? So keep the pot manageable and small with marginal aces that have showdown value and that have playability when checking back, but don't benefit from building a large pot. Let's jump into the next example of playing aces post-flop, which is playing aces brute force in 3-bet pots. Now in 3-bet pots, pocket aces are often used to go for a large bet right away by potting. Pocket aces in 3-bet pots are very often holding marginal playability. They often have marginal runouts. We can deny equity by potting and making our opponent fold, having to fold out equity. We lower positional disadvantage when we're out of position in a 3-bet pot. So imagine we 3-bet from the small blind against the button. The stack to pot ratio is around 3 to 3.5. Now if we pot, we basically tell our opponent we're not going to fold there anymore. So we lower our positional disadvantage by making our opponent having to decide on the flop already whether he's going to fold, maybe sometimes call, but very often either fold or get the money in there. And therefore we don't have that positional disadvantage anymore. If we go, for example, for a small bet on the flop and our opponent then floats, we still have to play turns and sometimes also rivers out of position in like an SPR2 situation, for example. And that's not always that great with aces, especially if runouts and additional equity with our aces is quite marginal there. And therefore we cannot apply pressure on turns and rivers very often. So we'd rather do that on the flop right away and make our opponent fold or get the money in right away. By potting, as mentioned, we basically make it a one-street game, which is something that we prefer to do very often with our pocket aces. I'm going to give you an example here to illustrate this a little bit better. Let's imagine you 3-bet from the small blind against the button. The flop comes down 9-7-3 rainbow. Now this is a mid-low dry board. There are some draws out there, of course. The board doesn't really benefit our range very strongly in ways that we have a lot of strong made hands here, like sets and 2 pairs and combo draws. But we do have a lot of overpairs here that have a lot of equity against our opponent's full range here. Our opponent obviously does have some made hands here, like sets and 2 pairs, but very often here he will have a dry overpair, he will have a 1-pair hand with a gutter or with a backdoor flush draw, for example. And if we pot here with our aces, we can put a lot of pressure on those hands that do have a significant amount of equity. We can put him in a scenario where he has to decide whether to go with his hand right away, whether to peel for a very expensive price, or whether to just fold and let his hand and his equity go. Now let's jump into some examples here. We bet full pot with hands like ace 6-5 and ace jack jack. Now on a board like 9-7-3 rainbow, our range basically has a full pot strategy or a check. We don't really benefit here from betting smaller. So that also includes for our aces. We're not going to bet small here on a very dry board like this. We want to fast play our range, pot, and put our opponent in a difficult position there. Even though he's in position, we're going to put him in a tough spot by applying max pressure with our range that is heavily leaning towards overpairs like aces here. Now a hand like ace 6-5, of course, we do have enough equity obviously here to bet and stack off. We have 2 backdoor flush draws, we have an inside straight draw, or we have an open ender even here with the 6-5. And with the ace jack jack, we have blockers to combo draws like Jack 10-8, for example, Jack 10-9, those type of hands. We do have a backdoor flush draw, and the jacks are connected enough to the board that we justify here to pot and go and stack off against the raise. Now, what I see many players do here, which is why I'm showing this, is that I see many players making the mistake of betting too small here. And what then will happen here, especially with a hand like Ace Jack Jack, for example, is that your opponent is going to call against a half pot size bet, for example, and the turn brings an awkward card for you, and you're out of position in this SPR 1.5 or SPR 2 situation where you cannot bet anymore because the board texture changed in favor of your opponent, and your hand is basically unplayable. Let's say the turn brings a 5 or a 4 or an 8 or a 6. Like all these cards, your range and specifically your hand here will suffer so much that you don't want to get yourself into that scenario by betting small on these dry textures. You just want to go large right away. We don't use a very polarized strategy in this scenario. We use a much more merged strategy where we're potting a large portion of our range here, and we stack off with most of these hands. So keep in mind that in the future, when you enter these 3-bet pots on these driest textures, that you don't benefit as much from going small here, especially with these type of hands. You want to put a lot of pressure out of position here on your opponent with hands that don't have great runouts and that don't benefit from playing a multi-street game plan out of position here. Now, hands that you want to check here and basically go for a check fold on this board, they are completely disconnected with the board. They don't have any backup, and they do very poorly against your opponents getting it in range. Hands like Ace King Queen, for example, or Ace Queen Deuce without a backdoor flush draw. Like these hands, they don't have additional equity, they don't have backdoor flush draws, and if the money would go in, we do very badly here. We also don't have much fold equity if we pot here because we have no blockers or no additional equity to the board. We don't have any connection to the 9-7-3 section here on the board. I see many players just randomly potting these hands and stacking off. And you want to think about, like, on these textures, that do you have any form of blocker to the board? Do you have any form of additional equity or backdoor equity? And if those things are true, and if you have those hands, those components in your hand, then you're often justified here to pot on board textures like this. But if you don't have that, if you are completely disconnected like these examples, then think about it, whether you really want to pot or go for a check and potentially a check fold here. Because you have very low fold equity, you don't have backup and additional equity, and you can protect your checking range here by slow playing some sets or 2 pairs, the few combinations that you have in your range there, to make sure that also your checking range is protected with a few combos in there as well. So make sure to not overvalue these bare aces there, and make sure to pot if when necessary here with the full pot examples like Ace 6-5 and Ace Jack Jack. Now let's look into the last example and the last topic of today's lesson. So we focused on single raise pot in position c-betting, and we learned more about 3-bet pot strategy by potting a lot with our pocket aces. Now we're going to talk about 4-bet pots. Now imagine you sit in the cutoff, you open raise and the button 3-bets you. Now you 4-bet from the cutoff against the button with your pocket aces, and the flop comes down 9-8-7, two-toned. What are you doing? I see many players at low stakes PLO just potting randomly their entire range, or at least all their aces here, because they believe that the SPR is so low, which is around 0.8, 0.9, that is sort of the SPR there. And they think, well, I have pocket aces, the SPR is low, so we can stack off regardlessly. But that's not the case here, and that's not true. You always want to think about pre-flop ranges and the interaction with the board. You want to think about how your pre-flop range is built. So here you have 4-bet pre-flop, which means that almost your entire range is built out of pocket aces here. And a lot of these aces, they are completely disconnected from this board. On the other hand, your opponent did 3-bet button versus cutoff. And that 3-betting range has a lot of double-suited rundowns in there, a lot of ace-x double-suited and some single-suited combinations in there with rundowns There are some high pairs with connectivity, and most of his range will interact quite well with a board texture like this. So if you pot your pocket aces here, you have very little fold equity, first of all, and which means that your pocket aces need a significant amount of equity to stack off here. Now, on the other hand, you want to think about your entire range here. Because if you are holding a lot of aces that are very disconnected to this board and they cannot bet to stack off, you need to check them. And when you need to check a large portion of your range because they cannot bet and stack off here themselves, you need to make sure to protect your checking range. By doing that, you basically have to check also a lot of your strong mate hands. Now on this board texture, which is a very extreme example, here we should check our entire range on the flop. Now, there are a lot of boards like straight boards, for example, where we do have some sort of betting range like 20% or 50%. It depends a little on the high card, on the connectivity of the board, how many straights are available. Now, this is a very extreme example. We wouldn't see bet here with our entire range almost on this board. But I see players betting here like a lot and a lot. And you want to think more about range versus range interaction with the board texture and build your decision based on that. So I'm going to give you a few examples here of aces that we should check and go for a check getting it in, or aces that we should check and go for a check fold. Now aces that we would check call here on the flop. So we check as the pre-flop 4-better, the button shoves the money in here, and now we have to make a decision whether to check call or to check fold. Ace 6-9, for example, here would be a hand to check call. We block top pair. We have a straight draw with the 6. Obviously, our opponent can have a lot of better hands at this point, but a top pair blocker with a straight draw is unfoldable at this point at this low SPR. So we go for a check and go for a check call here. Another example here would be aces queen jack. We have the backdoor nut flush draw. We have the nut gutter. We block some of the nut hands in our opponent's range, and we go for a check and stack off here basically. Hands set to check fold here are, for example, aces king queen. So here we don't have that gutter. So you see the subtle difference here with aces queen jack and aces king queen. So it's a straight draw or no straight draw, and that basically decides whether we can check call or check fold. We still have the backdoor nut flush draw. We have 4 overcards, but this hand is still not great enough to stack off on this specific board texture. Another hand would be aces king 9. So we block top pair. We have a flush draw blocker even. We have aces king, but also this hand is not capable of checking to check and stack off here. You should be able to check fold these type of hands that do very poorly against your opponent's value range and even your opponent's semi-bluffing range here, where he has a lot of draws in his range, like combo draws, 1 pair plus flush draws, those type of hands. And these check fold examples, they do just very badly against that specific part of your opponent's range. So I'm gonna, before we're gonna wrap it up, like we learned more about single raise pot in position strategy with aces, 3-bet pot strategy with aces, 4-bet pot strategy with aces. So 3 tips and ideas to help you out there and to make sure to become more aware in those situations when you are sitting there with aces in one of these scenarios. Remind yourself of these 3 tips that I gave you. We're gonna definitely look into more examples and more of these topics in future videos. Let me know in the comment section what you think about it, whether you like it or not, what you want to see in the future as well. Do you like to see more about single raise pots, 3-bet pots, 4-bet pots, playing aces or another situation? Please let me know, and I'm happy to jump into that topic. If you liked the video, make sure to give it a thumbs up and follow the channel if you enjoyed these videos. This was my 2nd video here on YouTube. So we're gonna upload a new video pretty soon again. Hope you enjoy it, and I will see you in the next one. Take care. Have a good day. Bye.